Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Earlier this year, Chile drafted one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It would have guaranteed rights for indigenous people, new social policies, and environmental protection. Let's discuss what a constitution is, why Chile's proposed constitution was unprecedented, and why it ultimately failed. You can find a full transcript of today's episode over on the Thinking in English blog. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more content, and leave a like, rating, or review wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Progressive. Progressive. Progressive ideas or systems are new and modern, encouraging change in society. For example, his government promised to introduce more progressive social policies. Right. Right. The fact that a person can expect to be treated in a fair, morally acceptable, or legal way. As in, everyone should have the right to education. Principle. Principle. The basic idea or rule that explains or controls how something happens or works. For instance, the country is run on socialist principles. Fundamental. Fundamental. Forming the base from which everything else develops. As in, we need to make fundamental changes to the way in which we treat our environment. Free market. Free market. An economic system with only a small amount of government control, in which prices and earnings are decided by the level of demand. For example, in a free market, if demand for a product increases, then so does its price. Indigenous. Indigenous. Used to refer to or relating to the people who originally lived in a place. As in, the Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. Provision. Provision. A statement within an agreement or law that a particular thing must happen or be done. For example, there are provisions in the law to protect foreign workers. Misinformation. Misinformation. Wrong information. Information intended to deceive, or the fact that people are misinformed. For example, there's a lot of misinformation about the disease online. Earlier this year, the South American country Chile announced plans to produce the world's most progressive constitution. The constitution would have been historic and a world first. It would have guaranteed legal protection for the environment and indigenous peoples. There would have been access to universal healthcare and the right to an abortion. This new constitution would have gone beyond most other constitutions in the world by focusing on social and economic rights, rather than just political and legal rights. It was supported by the country's left-wing government and took years to draft and create. And then, it was rejected. Most Chileans decided against the new constitution. Today, I'm going to explain the ideas behind constitutions. Then I will discuss why Chile's proposed constitution was so remarkable and why it failed. What is a constitution? I'm sure you have heard the term constitution before. Every country has a constitution, and some countries, like the USA, love to talk about their constitutions all the time. I think I have mentioned the word constitution at least 20, maybe 100 times in my previous episodes. Even the earliest episodes on the 2020 American election included the word constitution. But what actually is a constitution? I find the easiest way to think of a constitution is as a rule book. It is the rule book for a country or a state. Within the constitution, you can find the principles of that country. It contains the institutions that make up the country. For example, the parliament, the government, the legal system, the role of the military, and more. It explains the relationships between these institutions and their roles within the state. The Constitution also sets out the rights available to citizens of a country. For example, the freedom of speech or the right to vote in elections. The basic rules of a society are contained within the Constitution. How leaders are chosen, what citizens can and can't do, limitations on power, and much more. The majority of constitutions take the form of a real physical document. And on this document, the rules of society are written down. We call this form of constitution a codified or written constitution. Usually they are created after a major historical event. The American Constitution was written after a revolution. The Japanese and German constitutions after total defeat in a war. The post-Soviet Russian and also South African constitutions after a complete change in the system of government. And the constitutions of most African countries after independence from European empires. Within a codified or written constitution, the laws written down are considered fundamental. They are superior, they are more important to other laws, and they cannot be changed easily. If you remember the episode from a few months ago on the Supreme Court, you will notice how the main role of that court in the USA is to judge laws against the standards of the Constitution. Is it possible to change a constitution? Yes, but it's not always easy. You usually require a national referendum, a supermajority vote in a Congress, or even both. As the Constitution is considered the fundamental laws of a country, it should be difficult to change without a high level of support. In the US, for example, to change the Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives have to support the change. And then 38 of the country's states also have to agree. Does the UK have a constitution? Well, I mentioned how most countries have codified constitutions, but does every country? What happens if a country has never had a revolution, never been totally defeated in a war, never became independent, or never had a dramatic change in government? Well, you get a country like the UK, my country. And the UK constitution is often described as unwritten. If you search online, you cannot find one single document with the fundamental principles of the UK, because it doesn't exist. Technically, it is not correct to say that the UK constitution is completely unwritten, as a lot of it is written down, but just not in one place on one piece of paper. The UK constitution has never been codified. That is, it's never been brought together in one clear and concise document. New Zealand and Israel are two other famous examples of countries without written constitutions. The UK has not had the kind of historic event that usually produces a constitution. Rather than dramatic change, our country has evolved slowly and steadily into a democratic constitutional monarchy. For a brief time, about 500 years ago, England did have a constitution after a revolution led by Oliver Cromwell, but this was short-lived and things quickly returned to normal. However, the UK does still have a constitution. It's just more difficult to see. It's found in the laws, conventions, legal decisions, and political treaties that characterize British politics. Conventions are things that are technically not laws, but widely accepted traditions that have become basically a law, such as the Prime Minister must be from the House of Commons in the UK. They cannot be from the House of Lords. There's no law saying this, but it's just a convention. So now we know what a constitution is. What was happening in Chile? Well, Chile is a country stretching down the Pacific coast of South America. The current constitution was created under the leadership of Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet was a right-wing military dictator who took power after overthrowing the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende in 1973. Under Pinochet's rule, thousands of people were tortured, murdered, or disappeared as he cracked down on any criticism or opponents. Pinochet included a series of free market-inspired economic principles in his constitution. He lowered tariffs, invited foreign investment, made money on increasing copper prices, and joined trade agreements to boost the Chilean economy. While it did bring a certain amount of economic prosperity to the country, the Chilean people could never forget the crimes of Pinochet's government. He was forced out of power in 1990, but his constitution and his influence remained. Economic growth began to slow down and had stagnated by 2010. And by 2019, most poor Chileans had problems accessing healthcare and education. And even middle-class Chileans were forced to pay for privatized services just to live a normal life, like private education or private hospitals. The economic prosperity that came from Pinochet's constitution did not reach the whole country. Chile is significantly more unequal than most other developed countries. Employment is low, and they don't spend much money on education comparatively. In October 2019, mass protests broke out across the country. Ordinary Chileans, student groups, and indigenous peoples demanded change and resisted government restrictions for months. Eventually, the protests brought about a decision to create a new constitution. In October 2020, the vast majority of Chileans voted in support of creating a new constitution, and they chose 155 people to write it. The group of 155 people were chosen by the citizens, and mainly included liberal and independent politicians, as well as 17 seats reserved for indigenous peoples. Most modern constitutions are based on something called civil and political rights. Chile, however, wanted to incorporate economic, social, and cultural rights. While both of these types of rights are considered fundamental human rights, there is an important difference. Civil and political rights are seen as simple. They just involve the government not interfering with the rights of its citizens. Right? It's easy to give people civil and political rights. Giving people freedom of speech is easy. Just don't stop them speaking. Giving people the right to assemble is easy. Don't make it difficult for certain people to get together. On the other hand, economic, social, and cultural rights tend to involve higher levels of economic investment and government action. These rights include things like the right to food, right to healthcare, and right to education. And to achieve these, the government must actively be involved. This is a very simple explanation of human rights, and I might discuss this difference more in the future. But economic, social, and cultural rights formed an essential part of Chile's new constitution. The constitution they produced was unprecedented. It gave a level of rights to indigenous peoples that other countries have resisted. Under the constitution, indigenous people would have control of their own territory, their own legal systems, and indigenous politicians would need to be involved in all levels of government. The constitution also had provisions making sure that women were fairly represented in government and public organizations. The rights of LGBTQ people were recognized, and the constitution guaranteed access to healthcare, education, water, and housing. It contained provisions to increase technological and scientific developments within the country. Nature was also given rights, a strong form of environmental protection, and maybe most remarkably, the constitution would have given a constitutional right to abortion. Abortion was illegal in Chile until 2017, and the new constitution would have enshrined the right to it. In addition, there would be major political reforms. The role of Congress would change. Presidents would be allowed to serve more times, and the people would have more power. In summary, the constitution would have fundamentally changed Chile. It would have introduced a wide range of social rights that are generally not included in most countries' constitutions. Indigenous people would gain unprecedented rights, and there would be a high level of environmental protection and social rights. But as I mentioned right at the beginning of the episode, the constitution failed. It was not approved by the majority of Chilean citizens. Despite most people wanting a new constitution, they were reluctant to support the one that was drafted. It wasn't even a close vote. 62% of people voted against it. There are a variety of reasons why. Chileans wanted change, but the change in the constitution was radical and extreme. The group that wrote the constitution was mainly left-wing and independent members. There was a lack of conservative members who would have countered the progressive ideas and perhaps produced a more balanced constitution that was still progressive but also realistic. The constitution would have changed the country's entire social and political system. Many Chileans, including some indigenous groups, were concerned at the idea of an indigenous legal system and confused by the new powers given to indigenous peoples. There was also worries about how the country was going to afford the new policies, and whether these policies would actually be able to become a law. However, the biggest issue was likely a lack of communication and a lot of misinformation. A lot of Chilean people believed false reports online that exaggerated or misinterpreted certain measures within the constitution. One widespread rumour was that the government would be given the right to confiscate private property. Another was that abortion would be legal until 9 months of pregnancy. While these were not true, or not mentioned in the constitution anyway, the committee that drafted the constitution could not communicate their ideas effectively. Millions of Chileans lost trust in the people writing the constitution. And even though they wanted change, they didn't want such extreme change. So here is today's final thought. Chile's attempt at creating a new and progressive constitution failed. The change was too much and not communicated effectively. Rather than building a constitution that would be a compromise between different political ideologies, the constitution was mainly developed by progressive members with strong ambitions. I personally think the ideas within the Chilean constitution are amazing. They're excellent. I am a big supporter of indigenous rights, and I think we need to pay more attention to economic, social, and cultural rights. But I'm also realistic and a little pessimistic. It's expensive and would require major changes that could cause social problems. However, while Chile rejected this constitution, they will have more chances for a new constitution in the future. In 2020, they voted for a new constitution. And that means they will keep writing one until they get approval. The next draft will probably be written by more moderate members, but will definitely keep some progressive elements. But what do you think? Would you have voted in support of Chile's new constitution? What kinds of things should a constitution include? Let me know your thoughts and ideas on these questions. You can leave a comment on the Thinking in English blog, you can leave a comment on Spotify, or you can send me a message on Instagram, Thinking in English Podcast over on Instagram. Leave me a follow and let's try to get to 10,000 followers by the end of the year, I guess. 10,000 is what I want. And if you love listening to Thinking in English, please leave a like and a rating and a review wherever you listen. And if you really love listening to Thinking in English, subscribe to me on Patreon. Patreon is a platform for fans to support their favourite podcasts, and in return for a little bit of money every month, I let you join our conversation club, which we run every Tuesday at 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. UK time. So that is 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. Brazilian time, or 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. Japanese time. So you can work out the time zones of your own country, I guess. But there should be a time for everyone. And also bonus episodes, and there's one-on-one conversations with myself, and much more personal contact with me as well. If you can ask me any of your English questions in the Discord server, and I will be sure to answer. So please consider joining Patreon. Thank you for listening. Leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.